All right, let's talk about the media, defamation, a Supreme Court case called New York Times v. Sullivan, and Donald Trump's war on the media, which is being waged right now. Defamation. If it's between two private individuals who aren't famous or don't have any notoriety or anything like that, defamation generally consists of person A saying something defamatory or untrue about person B. Whether they're talking to other people or talking to person B's coworkers, or saying something shitty about them on social media, like making videos about another creator and saying that creator is a racist or a sexist or a homophobe when it's not true. Generally, defamation consists of an untrue statement that is published to third parties that causes person B actual harm. And then that person can demonstrate their harm and demonstrate that they've been damaged by that in some way, shape, or form. However, the New York Times v. Sullivan case came about. It was a 1964 Supreme Court case. And this person, Sullivan, who was a public person, who had some notoriety, was known to the public, sued the New York Times for something they said about him that he claimed was not true. And the Supreme Court in that case was like, well, if it's a public person or a public company, a public entity that is suing a news organization for reporting that news organization did on them, the plaintiffs in those cases, public persons, have to prove an additional prong, an additional component. And that additional component is actual malice. Meaning that if a public person sues a media organization for defamation, they not only have to prove that the statement was untrue, that it was published, that it caused them actual damages, because sometimes news media publishes stories that they get from sources, and sometimes they get burned by sources who give them false information. The plaintiffs in those cases also have to prove what's called actual malice, and that goes to intent, meaning that plaintiffs in those cases have to prove that this news organization published a story about this person knowing ahead of time that it was false, and published that story with the intent to cause harm to that person, which news organizations don't do, unless you're Fox News. I'll come back to that in a second. So in the first example, when it's two individual people, the plaintiff in that case just has to prove negligence, which is 51%, more likely than not. When it's a public person or a public entity suing a news media organization, the actual malice component raises that burden of proof, essentially, and makes it much, much more difficult for plaintiffs to win those cases against news organizations. And the best example that we have in recent memory of this is Fox News and Dominion voting machines and Smartmatic voting machines. Smartmatic voting machines defamation suit against Fox News is still pending. Dominion voting machines lawsuit against Fox News for defamation was resolved a couple of years ago for almost $800 million. Why? Following the 2020 election, Fox News was losing audience share to Newsmax and OAN because Newsmax and OAN were being way more aggressive and fact-free in their reporting that the 2020 election had been stolen from Donald Trump. And because Fox News executives and on-air personalities were seeing their ratings decline, which would cause their revenues to decline for ad revenues, they jumped on board with the story, the reporting, that Dominion voting machines and Smartmatic voting machines had switched votes from Donald Trump to Joe Biden, and that Dominion voting machines had stolen the election from Donald Trump and gave it to Joe Biden. Fox News had to turn over all kinds of documents and internal communications during the discovery phase of that lawsuit after Dominion Voting Machines sued them. Then Dominion Voting Machines had all kinds of internal emails between Fox News executives and on-air hosts and text messages showing quite clearly that all of those people at Fox News knew that that story was false. They knew that Dominion Voting Machines had not switched votes from Biden to Trump, and that Dominion Voting Machines had not stolen the election from Trump and handed it to Biden. But they ran those stories anyway, knowing that those stories were false. They aired those stories anyway, repeatedly over a period of time. And that was the evidence that Dominion Voting Machines needed to meet that actual malice standard. And once Fox News realized that, they settled the case before it went to trial, and they settled it for almost $800 million. Smartmatic's defamation case against Fox News is still pending, but Dominion and Smartmatic also sued OAN and Newsmax. And there have been a couple of settlements in that regard too. So why does that matter right now? So Las Vegas casino owner Steve Wynn, a billionaire who's had a ridiculous amount of plastic surgery. He looks like a purse. And the hair plugs, holy shitballs, man. But he's a billionaire casino owner, buddy of Donald Trump, huge donor to the Trump campaigns, plural. He has filed a petition with the United States Supreme Court asking them to overturn Sullivan versus New York Times, meaning to remove that heightened standard of actual malice for suing news organizations, bringing that standard much lower to just a simple negligence, which would make it easier for public people, public entities, people like Donald Trump, to win those kinds of lawsuits against news organizations. And the impact that that would have is it would go quite a long way towards shutting down any negative reporting about Donald Trump and his current administration. Because the standard of proof for defamation would now be way down here, which is crazy. I've never really understood why somebody like Trump would want that standard thrown out, because he lies about everybody all the time. He says defamatory statements about other people 50 times a day. But, you know, look at the lawsuits that have... He sued George Stephanopoulos and ABC News because George Stephanopoulos accurately described Donald Trump as a rapist on the air, as had been determined by a federal judge in New York. Donald Trump, as a matter of law, could not win that lawsuit, period. Period. ABC News paid him $16 million to make him go away and leave them alone. The other two lawsuits, Meta and Twitter, were for deplatforming. That doesn't have to do with defamation. But the ABC News lawsuit was a defamation suit. If the Sullivan standard was gone, if the actual malice requirement was gone, Donald Trump could win that lawsuit against them. And that's what he wants, because he wants to terrify our media, our mainstream media. He wants to terrify them to a point where there is no negative news about his presidency or his administration that gets reported out anymore, because our media is under threat and they're too afraid to do so. And if the Sullivan case gets overturned, that would go a very, very long way towards accomplishing that. Just one more rung on the authoritarian ladder. So with this court, I mean, it's not like there's a case pending before this court. Steve Wynn's just a guy. He happens to be a billionaire who owns a casino. He doesn't have a defamation case that's before the Supreme Court. He's just asked them to overturn this based on whatever. I don't know what this court will do with that, because this iteration of our Supreme Court is corrupt as fuck. And Clarence Thomas has said publicly he thinks that Sullivan should be overturned. He also thinks that gay sex should be criminalized again, that there shouldn't be any LGBTQ rights to marry or adopt. And, you know, he doesn't think people should have access to birth control. But, you know, that's Clarence Thomas. Super fun guy. Brett Kavanaugh has given a couple of public remarks in support of the ruling in the Sullivan case. So it certainly seems like he's on record supporting that case and supporting not overturning it. But it's this Supreme Court, man. Who knows? Who knows? But if the Sullivan case gets overturned, be very, very dark days ahead for our mainstream media. Not that they're amazing to begin with, but, you know, whatever. It would be a bad thing if this case got overturned. It would be a very, very bad thing.